Support this podcast at patreon.com/Kris Karl Photography Podcast. Obviously, to lay the groundwork, an important thing for us to know is how you got started in photography. So at what age did you start and what was the reason behind it?
Well, I got started in my late 20s. And, I had a job at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York as a night watchman. So instead of watching the monitors at night, I would go down to the bookstore and read all these books on photography. Also, these artists would come in at night to install their shows. So I got to meet people like Richard Avedon and Nan Golden and even Ralph Gibson. So that really piqued my interest. The Ralph Gibson show especially is one of my favorite photographers. He had a show called The Somnambulist. It's about about the dream state.
Right.
All images were related to that dream state, and they were so evocative that pretty soon I started analyzing my dreams, and that's when I realized the power of the single image, the power of photography. Pretty soon thereafter, I went out to B&H and bought a Pentax K1000 film camera and taught myself photography. And started photographing anything and everything that I saw on the street. Wasn't very good. At one point, I started imitating Ralph Gibson, and I was just doing a lot of bad imitations of Ralph Gibson. So I just eventually moved up to medium format and thought I would do portraits. I was horrible at that. And then I moved up to 4x5. I bought a 4x5 field camera, and then I spent maybe 6 or 7 years on and off doing landscape photography out in the western part of the United States. Sold some prints, but after a while, again, I think I was just burnt out and doing derivative work and wasn't inspired. So I eventually sold all of my large format equipment and didn't photograph for a few years. And then maybe like 5 years ago, picked up a Panasonic GH4. And I thought I'd do movies and realize how hard that was. So I was going to sell that camera. But then I realized, hey, this is a stills camera also. So I went out and started shooting street at night after work. And I got hooked, I discovered Instagram and all the street photographers on Instagram. And it's been only about a year and a half that I've been doing street photography, but here I am. I'm still doing it.
Well, within the genre of street photography, what is your favorite sort of sub-subject to photograph?
Well, here's the issue, especially in New York, there are a lot of street photographers, and, you either fall into two camps. You're like in like the Gary Winogrand, Joel Meyerowitz camp where you're Fifth Avenue and you're shooting crowds and, people are coming at you and you're trying to find layer composition and all that. Or you're under the Saul Leiter school where you're doing color abstract stuff. I feel more, I like shooting a broader range of subjects, more ecumenical as far as subject matter. I consider a lot of things street photography. So if I'm walking down the street and I see a glass on a table in an outdoor cafe and the light is hitting it in a certain way and there's like a Mexican flag behind it, I'm going to shoot that, and that's street photography. It's not still photography to me. If I'm walking down the street and I see a 1968 Camaro and it's got this beautiful, shiny black roof that reminds me of the skin of a fish, and then a green paint that reminds me of the skin of an animal or plant. juxtaposed with shiny glass. I'm going to photograph that, and that's not automotive photography; it's street photography. If I'm walking down the street and I see a person, like this past weekend, I was in Coney Island and I saw this gentleman, Luis Mendez, who's this legend street photographer. He's 80 years old, has been shooting since the 50s, and I took a picture of him, and people say, well, that's portraiture, that's not street photography. Just no, it's street photography. I'm walking down the street and there he was.
Yeah.
So as far as genre or styles, I mean, I'm very open. I mean, I don't fall into a certain camp. And sometimes it could cause problems. People send me emails saying, well, what you shot is not technically street photography. Don't call it street photography. And I don't buy into that. I think a lot of things can be street photography.
It seems like a really reductive attitude to have. I see it quite a lot with street photography, in the sense that it's almost like there's a gatekeepers union for what can and can't be classed as street photography.
Well, these street photography collectives, I don't think I'd ever join one, because some of them are just so close-minded, and you have to shoot in a certain style, and if your style is not easily defined, if like somebody looks at your photograph and they can't pin it on you, saying this is a distinctive style, then it's not valid, which I find ridiculous. So William Eggleston had the same problem when he started out. He was photographing the banal, and they said his photos are about nothing. But if you look back, he's been shooting for 50 years. If you look back at the collection of his work, then all these little things that were about nothing collectively were about something. They were about an era. They were about his particular environment, which was down south. So there are a lot of things that one can shoot, and it doesn't have to have a distinctive fingerprint to be valid, to be called street photography.
Do you think that's the problem with street photography, in the sense that, as it's happening, sort of present day street photography, you end up being more focused on defining an era rather than just then sort of just collecting images of it? So you're almost sort of tainting the water, in a sense, like you're kind of biasing the creation of that record by trying to make it look a certain way.
Well, you walk around. I walk around New York, and everything seems so homogenized, and it can be very tempting to just photograph nostalgia, just for nostalgia's sake. Again, I try to be more broad. I'll photograph contemporary things, but I also photograph things that remind me of another era. Because that era is today also. The past is also the present.
Yeah.
So I don't see any contradiction in that.
I mean, you've mentioned cars, specifically sort of nostalgic Americana automobiles are incredibly photogenic. But why are they so photogenic, and why do they lend themselves so well to street photography?
Well, they're beautiful pieces of sculpture. Trying to photograph contemporary cars is very difficult because everything's homogenized in this era. You look at those cars from let's say the 60s, American cars, and everything was unique. The design was very distinctive, and that kind of reflected the era. America was much more ambitious back then. They went to the moon and all that. Nowadays, everything is the same architecture, same fashion. Yeah. Everybody goes to the Gap or whatever, and everybody looks the same. The cars are the same. So I think people do have a bit of a nostalgia when they see these cars, but it's for an era that was much more forward-looking than I think today is. There's groupthink and all that in this era. Everybody has to think the same. So there's nothing very distinctive about a lot of the industrial design than I see today.
100%. Yeah, 100%. Couldn't agree more. Let's talk about when you head out to shoot. So do you go out with a set idea of exactly what it is that you want to go and photograph? Or do you go to a specific place and just see what you're given and try and make the best of what you've got?
Well, I have different routes that I follow, different neighborhoods, and I'll pick a neighborhood and I'll just stay in that neighborhood for the whole day. It can be difficult because there are so many other street photographers, and they follow this sometimes almost the same route. You know, New York is the funny thing about New York is most people photograph just in Manhattan. You know, but the other boroughs probably had a lot more interesting things to see. Is that a lot of people are not ambitious enough to go to these other parts of New York and photograph. And it can be difficult sometimes. You know, in Manhattan, it's much more of a transient place, and people really don't care if you take their photographs that much. Whereas in the other parts of New York or the other boroughs, it's people will let you know. You know, you can get challenged a lot more, so people become afraid to go to those areas. But I think there's a lot of missed opportunity, and you know, as the years go on, I think that's one of my goals is to explore the other parts of New York, not just Brooklyn and Williamsburg. And
well, Williamsburg is amazing.
Yeah, it is, but it's also, you know, a million photographers are there. So,
yeah,
you know, going up to the Bronx or farther reaches of Queens, or it doesn't even have to be in Manhattan per se. You know, I live in New Jersey, so I've been starting to walk around Hudson County and photographing places like Hoboken and Jersey City and those places, which is right across the river from Manhattan. Similar sensibilities, but a lot less dense. So I'm trying to get out of my comfort zone of Manhattan. Most people just shoot Manhattan, and that's when people think of New York City, they think of Manhattan, but it's a much broader place.
Right. And do you set yourself restrictions in a sense of sort of like limiting yourself to a specific piece of gear, like only one lens, or only going out to photograph one particular type of subject? Or are you just very open with that?
Well, as far as subject matter, I'm very open. But as far as gear, usually I'll just bring along my 27 millimeter pancake lens and my Fuji 35 1.4 lens. That's just the way I see the world. Anything more than that just weighs me down, and I never really use them. I always think I'm going to use them. Sometimes I would bring them along just to say, well, it's going to be that one in a million shot, and I can use that super wide, whatever, 16 millimeter 1.4. But then I realized, no, that's never going to happen because I just don't see the world that way. So I do set limits, and it's usually just focal length, 35 and a 27, basically.
Are you quite mobile in the sense of like you're walking and shooting, or do you find an area that you like and just sort of use your patience and wait for something to develop?
Oh, well, I'm kind of bad that way. If I find a spot that I think has a lot of potential, I'll stay there for 2, 3 hours, 4 hours. I don't really care. You know, when I photograph, I usually just block off the whole day just to photograph. And if it's something that I think is going to have a lot of potential, I'll just hang out there for a long, long time. Sometimes it's frustrating because I come away with nothing, but usually if there's great light or great composition, or, you know, there's like this chromatic conflict in the scene, there's these colors clashing against each other, I'll stay there for a long, long time. I do a lot of things that you're not supposed to do. Like I overshoot, you know, I'll just go through a 128 gig card in one session. And I'll come out with just like 1 or 2 good photos. I chimp too much, I admit. I also crop a lot. You know, if I have a great shot that, you know, I see a great scene across the street and it's a split second to get the shot, and I'll take the shot. And if it's way too wide, I'll just crop it in post. I'm not very strict about that or restrictive when it comes to cropping. Whatever it takes to get a good composition, good lighting, great color conflict, then it's fine with me. I don't follow a lot of rules, basically.
Well, in terms of your actual eye and the way that you're seeing things, what's the most important compositional element for you? Is it the light or the color, or is there like frame within frame?
It varies, but usually, I always try to look for that one person, that one element in the scene that I'm going to focus on, even though there's a million people in the scene. It's always that one person that I'm trying to focus on, or that one particular element. Let's say the roof of a car. There could be an edge that's particularly interesting. Edge of the roof, the way it curves into the glass or something like that. I'll focus on that, and then I usually shoot wide open. By the way, I always shoot at 1.4. A good thing about the Fuji lens is that I could shoot wide open in broad daylight, and it goes into automatically to the mechanical shutter, so I won't have to put on all these ND filters.
Right.
So I can just seamlessly just shoot wide open, even in broad daylight. So I can shoot from day to night, and it doesn't really matter.
And is that to pull out that one particular element? It's to separate them from everything else?
Exactly. That's what it is, and that's what I'm looking for, that one element that facing the crowd. And it could be, doesn't have to be a face. This past weekend, there was a gentleman sitting on a bench, and he had on this marvelous, like a diamond watch, and he was kind of asleep. He had on a very colorful outfit, and I kind of just focused on that element, the watch, his hand. Everything else was kind of out of focus. But yeah, I'll usually hone in on one particular element, whether it's the watch, or if it's the color, I'll focus on that, or the lighting. Sometimes you'll get all three or all four elements in a frame, but usually it's one particular element that I'm focusing on. And right. I think color is usually, New York is it's a very monochromatic city. People don't realize this. They see pictures from the 1950s or 60s, and they think it's very colorful. But when they come here, they realize, no, it's a very gray city. Yeah. So other than Times Square and highly trafficked areas with the tourists, but on side streets and all that, very, very gray concrete. So if I can get a burst of color anywhere, I'm going for it. I'm just, that's like, it's like a lighthouse, I'm going straight for it. And I'll hover. And then if I see someone walking by, I'll focus on that person.
Well, I feel like text, such as signs, is a big part of a lot of your compositions, and that sometimes it seems to be for like geographical context, and other times it seems to be more nostalgic. Is it something that you look for specifically to include like signs as part of it to sort of ground the work and give away a little bit of the culture around it, or is it just coincidence?
Sometimes it's just coincidence. Sometimes it does give context. There was a shot I did in Brooklyn, and it said there was a giant sign, something about Brooklyn being very strong or something like that. But there was a gentleman walking across the street, and there was a shaft of light hitting him. And that's what I really focused on. The sign just happened to be in the frame. So it just kind of gave it an extra layer of context. But sometimes signs can be very distracting from the element that I'm trying to focus on. So I try to limit the signs, but New York, there are a lot of signs everywhere. So it's hard to crop that stuff out.
Yeah. Yeah, it's actually like the hardest thing I find about London is the amount of safety signs And I am someone that I'm prone to reading something in a photo before I look at the photo. If there's text, I tend to be drawn to that to read it before I even really take in the full picture. And it drives me absolutely mad in London because it's honestly almost impossible to photograph without getting some form of safety sign or another in. I find New York slightly different, I guess, because I'm English. I find it culturally interesting. The street signs I find interesting, whereas obviously the ones here are just irritating to me.
Yeah, the signs sometimes do provide a little bit of context, but also the signs here are very colorful. So that also is sometimes it helps to have a sign in because of the bright red stop signs, or the bright orange cones that you see. Traffic cones you see in the streets. Sometimes it adds context. It adds a little bit of chromatic conflict to the scene. But generally, I find these things a little distracting because I know that people are going to read the signs first, and it just draws the eye away from what I'm really trying to focus on. But it's a constant challenge. That's all I can really say about that. And
well, previously you've posted a fair amount of diptychs or collages of sort of matched up images of your work. And quite often it doesn't seem to be images that you would necessarily immediately assume were taken even remotely close to each other. But there's complementary elements, be it color or some kind of theme running through. Do you shoot images specifically to pair together with other images, or is it just something that you're looking for in post?
Sometimes I'll shoot images to pair with each other. Sometimes it's just a coincidence, and you just walk around New York and you're inspired by all these different lights and sounds and people. And I'll sometimes I'll delete the card. If I'll take 2 or 3 images off my memory card and then delete the rest. But sometimes I'll keep things that I think have potential for later on, and I'll put it in a folder. And then maybe a couple of months later, I'll look through them and I'll realize that a lot of these things, when they're merged together, they kind of create a certain mood or a certain sensibility. So I'll do a diptych. Again, I have a very broad definition of street photography.
Yeah.
That a lot of people would say, well, that's not street photography. That's kind of like a fine art thing, fine art photography. And I'm like, no, I shot these in the street. So I consider these things street photography, even though they're paired together. They convey the mood of walking the streets of New York at a certain time of day, a certain lighting, or certain eras. So, again, I'm not very strict when it comes to categories and putting things in little boxes. If I want to do a diptych or a triptych, I'll do that. If I want to just, do what people would call still life, a manhole cover or something, I'll do that. To me, it's all street.
It feels like maybe that the overriding need to belong to one genre or another is actually holding back quite a lot of photographers, because they're more focused on, well, I won't take this picture because it doesn't fit into the category of what I want to be associated with. And in fact, they're probably going to be turning down the opportunity to take some of their better photos because they're refusing to branch out.
Yeah, I think also, all of this stuff is really related to maybe probably in the late 70s where all of these photography programs became popular, these MFA programs, and people wanted to become an artist with a capital A, and they wanted to become professional. They wanted to become professionals and have gallery shows and books and all that. So you had to have some kind of signature style or theme or whatever. People still feel that way. Even amateur street photographers, you'll see a lot of people on Instagram and they'll tone their photographs a certain way. They'll shoot a certain way with a certain focal length, and it's all to have a consistent style, identifiable style. And I feel like for me, that's like a straitjacket. I feel it limits me a lot because I'll miss a lot of shots. And I think they have just as much validity, even though they don't relate to each other when you're just scrolling through my Instagram feed, because they create a certain sensibility of the era that I'm living in.
What's the overriding emotional response that you're looking for from your work?
That's a good question. I never thought of that. Just to see New York in a different way, because it's so competitive here, that a lot of photographs that I see on Instagram, they kind of all look the same. They're taken in the same location. I just want a broader perspective of New York. I shoot the macro, the big picture, and then the micro, the little picture, and anything in between. I don't want to do postcard photography.
Right.
So that's the only thing that I'm really after, is just to, if people come to visit New York, just that, hey, there are interesting things, not just above you, the buildings, but below you, on your feet, on the gutter, the puddle by the sewer with the reflections. That can also be fascinating. And if people see New York in a different light and they photograph a broader perspective of things, then that's pretty much what I'm after. So I'm satisfied with that.
Are there any cities that you haven't visited that you'd like to photograph?
Well, I've been to Moscow one time, and even, but very briefly, and I would love to go back to Moscow. That's one of those places where I rarely see photography from Russia, but it's I think more interesting than New York. It's so monumental. The subways and they have such a deep history there. You just don't see people walking around with cameras in Moscow, and that would be a great place to photograph. Hong Kong is also a great place to photograph, but also, Hong Kong has been photographed. It's like New York, where it's been photographed a lot. So if I would go to photograph Hong Kong, I would try to photograph something that most people wouldn't think was in Hong Kong, something different. And St. Petersburg is also an interesting city, so I would love to go there and photograph. But Eastern Europe, believe it or not, and in Asia would be the regions that I would love to spend a lot of time shooting in.
Well, one place I would absolutely recommend is Poland, because it feels slightly more low key in the sense of you won't feel. Russia comes with that overriding idea that you're constantly being watched and you're under threat, I guess. It's quite an intimidating nation, the way it's portrayed, and probably the way it portrays itself. Whereas Poland, I think, has just as much interesting architecture, has an absolutely fascinating history, obviously. And I think it goes under the radar a lot with people. It's somewhere that I'm hoping that in the next 2 years, provided that there's not another massive lockdown or something, I get the opportunity to go there and do some photography. Yeah,
again, Eastern Europe is one of those areas that I think hasn't been photographed enough. And it's much more interesting than people would normally think it would be. And it is under the radar, which is one of the reasons why street photographers should go there.
Do you have any? Do you have a most hated photography cliche?
Well, I fall into this trap a lot. There's always, you see a lot of shots of people like kind of walking mid stride in a street photograph, or just like one. And I'm guilty of doing that, but I'm trying to get away from that. And that's a cliche that I've seen. So it's an easy shot to take. But that's one of the cliches that kind of, it's starting to irk me, and I'm trying to get away from that. But it can be difficult sometimes, because the person sometimes adds scale or context to the composition, but it's something that I see too often. Now,
you mentioned earlier about sort of chimping too much being a bit of an issue. What do you think is your worst habit as a photographer?
I think, I overshoot too much, and I overthink too much. And I'm trying to kind of like get my technique more refined and to distill my vision a lot more. So when I walk up to a scene, I know exactly what needs to be photographed, which is like really hard. And sometimes I'll just kind of freak out if there's like great light or great color or something. I don't know where to start, and I'll get nervous and I'll just like start shooting everything. And I waste a lot of time in a particular scene just going around in circles, shooting the same thing over and over again. And I don't know if that's insecurity or just a nervous habit, but I'm trying to slowly get away from doing that and just.
Is that something that you're noticing afterwards, though, when you're looking back at the images, you're kind of seeing repetition, or is it something that as you're doing it, you're thinking, I need to get out of this?
It's usually when I'm doing it, I realize, okay, you've been here like 45 minutes shooting the same thing. It's time to move on. But sometimes when I'm going through the images at night, I'm just going through pages and pages of stuff, and I'm like, wow, this is basically the same thing. It's just like the camera is moved, 1 millimeter to the left or 1 millimeter to the right, or a little bit up or a little bit down, and just to get that right angle, or the sun gleaming off the paint at a certain angle. And sometimes I realize, well, it's not really necessary. And just trying to be more disciplined as far as my compositional technique, which is, I think, the hardest thing in photography is the composition. That's something I'm constantly working at.
Are you not tempted, given you've got a history of photographing film, are you not tempted to photograph film now with the work that you're doing? It seems to be a resurgence of film photography in street photography, especially. Is that not something that would interest you?
That's a good question. Actually, I have a Leica M3 and I have some film in it, some Kodak Ektar. And I keep saying I'm going to go out and shoot, but quite frankly, I was shooting for over 20 years on film. And when I was shooting film, there were a lot of limitations to shooting film. And I would always dream about having a camera that would have a lot of the things that digital cameras have now, like focus peaking and things like that. And then, years later, presto, there it is. We have these cameras that kind of like leave all the technical considerations to the computer, and then you as a photographer can just really focus on composition and lighting and color and all that. No, I find it harder to shoot film because it's really does slow you down. I think it slows me down too much. Right. And I find it interesting that so many of the younger photographers nowadays, they're fascinated with film, even though they grew up in a digital era. I don't know, the psychology behind that. Maybe they think it's just too easy to take photographs now. But, growing up in an analog era, there were a lot of mistakes made just on a technical side from shooting, and very like contrasty lighting, especially trying to shoot slide film. That I wasted so much money throughout the years just trying to learn the proper technique of shooting slide film that I could have probably bought like a whole set of Leica lenses and a couple of camera bodies. I mean, it gets really expensive even back then. So nowadays it's probably 2 or 3 times the cost. So I feel that there's a lot less room for experimentation with film photography. And since I'm still kind of new to street photography, I prefer shooting digital just because, if I make a mistake or whatever, it's not going to cost me anything. When I make a mistake with the film camera, I have to develop it and all that stuff. Just it costs a lot of money, and all these negatives just start to pile up, and it's you start throwing a lot of things away. So no, I mean, I have no great desire to shoot film, even though there's a lot of great work I see on Instagram of photographers shooting film, especially medium format stuff, landscape stuff. It's fantastic. Street photography stuff, it can be difficult. A lot of people shoot black and white film now, and they develop it at home, and that's great. And they scan it. So, but no, I just don't have a really great desire to shoot film. It's kind of an exotic thing now to shoot film for me, So if I was gonna shoot my Leica, I would probably go out into the countryside and make sure the lighting is not too contrasty and there's a lot of color. It's like one of those country cameras with it's not something that I would take into the city and do real kind of zone focusing and all that. And I think there's just too much room for error, and for me anyway.
I think the younger generation are fascinated by it because I think it's a couple of things. One, it's like the other. So it's subverting the norm, and that's a very young trait to kind of want to rebel against the standard. But also I think there's an attitude towards younger photographers that they have it easy because they've grown up in this digital age, and therefore they're not real photographers. It's something that I do hear more and more. It's a complaint or a comment that I get off of older generations. I joined a camera club last year to kind of give it a go, and it's a story I've gone over a few times, so I won't repeat myself. But it basically lived up to be exactly what I expected it to be, in the sense of it was sort of older generations telling younger generations that they don't really count when it comes to photography because they've had it too easy. And I think sometimes you kind of want to almost prove a point by going to film and showing that it can still be done. I don't know. It's like you say, it's kind of hard to find the psychology in it. I don't think a lot of people would probably be particularly honest about it either.
Yeah. And then, you said people don't consider you a real photographer unless you know how to shoot film. And, I don't buy into that. I mean, the hardest part for me about photography is actually the composition. If you can get a really great composition with all the other elements, then to me, and you get a great photo, that's the mark of a great photographer. I fell into that trap years ago. I got into 4x5 photography. I was shooting sheet film. I even got an 8x10 camera because I wanted to be a quote unquote real photographer. But I just found that, was a big mistake, as far as the cost and the time and the lenses were big and bulky and, just falling into peer pressure and saying, well, I'm not a real photographer because I don't shoot film or I don't shoot daguerreotypes. So that means I'm not a great photographer or a real photographer. And I just don't buy into that. I think the mark of a great photographer is having great photographs.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, everything else doesn't matter.
If you were to go back from sort of the position you're in now, the understanding that you have now and so on, and just give yourself some advice for when you first started out, what's the one thing that you would tell yourself to help you move along a lot faster through the gears?
Just to have persistence, lost a lot of years just because I got discouraged and I figured, what's the point? I'm never going to make a mark or whatever. And I think that was a big mistake because there were a lot of opportunities to take great photographs that I never took because of, all this pressure to become unique or well-known or whatever, or distinctive. And I think, photography could be a joy in and of itself. It doesn't have to have an end purpose. Nowadays, just going out with the camera and shooting on a beautiful day and being in the moment and blocking out all of your problems, I think to me that's reward enough. I get enough out of photography just doing that. It's a form of therapy, and it's something that I'll probably be doing for the rest of my life.
I think that's pretty much the perfect way to bring this to a close. This has been really, really fascinating. What we always like to do is make sure people know where they can find you. So if you want to give me any links and so on so people can find your work.
I'm on Instagram, Airboss, AIR_BOSS_1028, Airboss 1028.
Amazing. No, it's been absolutely fascinating. It's great to talk to you as well. I've been watching you for a little while now, and it's the best part about what's going on in the world is just the opportunity to talk to everybody that's been stuck at home or been looking for an outlet, a creative outlet. It's just to find out different perspectives from creatives. It's really fascinating.
Well, I like the fact that you have different types of photographers on your show, because I learned so much about different aspects of photography, especially wedding photography and portrait photography. Again, I think it's important to have a very broad perspective as far as what constitutes photography and not just fall into a very narrow camp.
Yeah.
And listening to your podcast helps a lot. So thank you very much.
This feels right, not